have the binding all wound up, and it looks so pretty, the ombre colors here all together. So before we start attaching the binding, let's talk about where to attach. So there is a possibility, you know, you have the diagonal seams throughout here, that you might have your connecting seams when the whole thing is around near an already existing seam, or maybe, you know, there's just a little error in the where you connect the two ends isn't as nice looking as you would hope. So keeping those kinds of things in mind, I like to put the starting point where I feel like my eye is least drawn to. And so for me, I would say sort of the bottom right corner of the quilt. It's not the top or bottom if it's on a bed where you'll see it. It might be hanging over the side. But the bottom right, just because our eyes kind of read from left to right, I think we might start by looking at the upper left of the quilt. And so the bottom right is where I like to start. Not at the very bottom, but, you know, below the midway point on the bottom right. And then another consideration before you attach the binding is if you have had your quilt quilted on a long arm, it may have this basting thread that you might want to remove. If it's less than 1/4 inch, it'll get covered and it's not worth removing, but if it's past 1/4 inch from the edge, you'll want to take that out first. So I'm going to do that first before I attach the binding. Alright, so now that my basting stitches are removed, I'm going to attach the binding using the binding tool here. And so this tool wants you to leave a 12-inch gap between the ends with 10 inches of tail of binding on each side. And it's really important to measure that 12 inches exactly if the pieces are going to connect exactly. So when you line up your binding, and again, I'm working on the bottom right edge of the quilt here, and the binding tool, as I said, wants 10 inches hanging over where I first attached this. So I'm going to measure 10 inches from the edge here, and I can see that it's right here, so I'm going to put a pin right at 10 inches, and I'm going to measure again, because even if you're off by like 1/8 of an inch or something, it might cause a pucker in the fabric. So again, I'm just going to nudge that over. Make sure I go through all the layers and measure one more time, and that looks good at 10 inches. So I have a 10-inch tail here, and I'm going to go ahead and start stitching from where that pin is going around. And this is a good time to check your bobbin that you have enough thread in there, especially if you have a larger quilt. And once we get to the end, I will show you how to finish using the binding tool. But again, it wants a 12-inch gap. So one more thing I'll do, because this will indicate my stopping point, is I'm going to measure 12 inches from this pin. I'm just going to put the 12-inch mark on the pin there. Make sure these edges are staying straight. And I'm going to mark 12 inches, so 2 inches past where my tail of the binding is. I'm going to mark right there, and that will tell me when I'm sewing to stop. And again, you want to make sure that it's 12 inches, and that looks good. Okay, so I'm going to try not to hit the camera here. I've got the roll of binding just right here in my lap, or you might put it off to the right. You can clip and pin the binding around ahead of time if you'd like. I find that if I just adjust and move it every few inches, that it's fine. So I'm gonna put my needle right on my pin and take the pin out, and then I like to just go forward a little and then back tack it just to hold it in place there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and start sewing the binding on. Again, the open edges of the binding should be aligned with the raw edge of your top and batting and backing. So just a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Make sure that the quilt is straight too as it goes through. There's no puckering. And I just stop every few inches just to straighten and align my edges. I'm just unwinding a little more of the binding on my spool here as I go. Alright, and we're already at our first corner, so let's talk about mitered corners. We're going to stitch until there's a 1/4 inch left, so I'll stop. I don't want my hand to be in the way. I'll stop stitching right about here, and then I'll show you what I do next. Let's go slow here, and maybe one more. Okay, so when I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt, I like to just back stitch to hold that in place, just a couple stitches, and then we're gonna just lift the needle, take it off. You can cut it, and now we're gonna make our mitered corner. So we're gonna rotate the quilt 90 degrees. Let's see if I can come in more here. I'll try and keep my hands out of the way. Alright, so I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So what I'm going to do now is take this top portion, and I want to make it go vertically, perpendicular to the binding I've already sewn on. And the key is making the diagonal end on the edge of the quilt. So make that diagonal so it all aligns. Then you're going to hold that down and pull the top piece down so the top edge is flush with the edge of the rest of the quilt. So it should look something like this. It's all flush. And then you're going to just stitch a 1/4 inch away from this new edge and go all the way down. So since I'm not starting in the middle of the quilt, I always send a bunny tail through, or my machine tends to chew things up. Okay, so I'm just going to hold that fold underneath, stick it the 1/4 inch mark, and just keep going. And then once I know it's made it through, I'm just continuing to align the edges. Coming up to my pin right down here, so I just want to talk about what you do when you get there. As you can see, I'm getting really close to being done with my binding, but I'll definitely have enough. I just wanted to show you the measurements are working out for how much I'll need. Alright, so our pin should be, as we double checked, 12 inches from where we started. So I want to try and hit where that pin is as exact as I can get it. So I'm going to go slow. And I see it approaching. I think maybe 2 more stitches should do it. 1, 2. And a back tack. And take it off. And before I start using the binding tool, I'm going to check a couple things. I'm going to measure in between to make sure that I don't need to take a stitch out or stitch a couple more. So let's see if I can turn this. So I'm just measuring between this spot where I started and where I just finished. I want to make sure it is 12 inches. This precision will really help avoid puckering or coming up short. And so when I do that, I don't know if you can see here, but I'm about just over 1/4 inch off. So I'm going to stitch it just a little more. And I can see that it's just on the 12 mark there. So this should be good. And so now, again, following the directions on the binding tool, I want to leave a 10-inch tail from where I stopped. So I'm going to measure 10 inches. It is right here. And again, I want to be precise so I don't have too much or too little. Alright, I'm going to put my scissors under the 10-inch mark there. Just cut. As you can see, this is all the binding that I had left, so less than a strip remaining. I'll just save that for something else later. So before attaching the 2 ends together, I like to just go around the whole quilt and make sure that both sides are 1/4 inch away from the edge, that nothing slipped when I was sewing it. And so I marked this section here because I noticed on the other side it was just getting too close to the edge there, so it wasn't totally aligned right here. So I'm gonna take a few stitches out and scoot it up just to make sure, you know, when it's going through the wash and stuff, I don't want the backing to come loose. So just go around and check for any areas that aren't 1/4 inch and fix those before attaching the binding. Alright, so now it's time to use the binding tool. And I like to orient the quilt the same way it looks here, so the quilt is above and the strips on the bottom. So that's what I have here. So we're on step 2. It says butt the flat edge of the tool up where I stopped sewing, and it should match this diagram here. I'm going to make a mark where it ends, so I'm butting it up where the sewing stopped. And then it says mark here on this line, so I'm just going to make a line here. This is an erasable chalk pencil, and then you can also, once you do that, open it and just continue the line. Okay, so once you have that solid line marked, you're going to take the binding tool and align the black line on here that's right next to side B. Align it to the line you just drew, and then just trace along the edge here, including this vertical line here, and that shows you where you're going to cut. Now you could just trace and then take this with a rotary cutter and go along the line. You could also, just if you have a smaller cutting mat, you could do it right on the cutting mat. So again, line up and then we'll cut this side off and then vertically up and down. Oops, try to get it all the way there. Okay, so we just take this little piece off and we have a slant with a vertical tip. So the second side, if we put this back to where we originally started, wants us to rotate 180 degrees and butt the binding tool up to the same place where the sewing stopped, which is right here, where that final stitch is. Okay, so this time we're gonna take, same thing, we're gonna line up to the B line, this vertical line here, and make a mark going down. Okay, but this time when we open it, we're gonna place the A tip on that line. So you can extend the line to the top again. So just like before, and extend the line all the way up. But now we're going to take the A tip, keeping it oriented the same way, line the A tip up to that line, and we're going to just cut here. Line up the A tip to that line that I drew, and again I'm just cutting here and here, and this is 2.5 inches, this ruler, just like the binding strip is 2.5 inches. So if you use 2¼ inch binding, you'll have to fudge this a little bit, but this one works really well this way. So I'm just going to be real careful because of the way I'm holding it. I don't want to cut anything by mistake. Kind of awkward angles here. There we go. All right, so again we have that vertical straight tip. All right, and the last step is to connect this side. So let's see if I can find a better angle to show this at. All right, so we're going to use 3 pins for this. Right sides together. We're going to take the flat edge and align it to the long edge of the piece underneath. And put a pin there. Okay, and then same thing on the other side. I'm going to take this flat edge and align it to the length of the strip. Put a pin there, and then just one in the middle to keep it from getting out of alignment. Okay, and then on the sewing machine, we're just going to sew 1/4 inch across here, so we can line the needle up where that fabric starts here in the corner, and that'll be 1/4 inch across. Alright, so we've got our ends connected here, and a couple troubleshooting things if you run across it. These are all things that have happened to me before, so I speak from experience. Sometimes if I don't pay attention to how I align the pieces, you might get a twist when you try to flatten the binding and line it up edge to edge. If that's the case, just undo the stitches where you connected it, and then just really look at how it's aligning and make sure that the right sides are together, and when they are pressed they will look like this. Another thing that has also happened is sometimes I have too much fabric. Even though I tried to measure carefully, I might see when I lay it flat that there's a little mound of fabric still there. And so if that's the case, I just take the stitches out, put it back on the cutting mat, and take my binding tool again and cut off one side, you know, a little bit at a time. It's better to just cut off a little and have to do it again than cut off too much and now you're too short. If you do come up short and it's just too tight and not going across, then maybe just make a smaller seam allowance instead of a 1/4 inch. Perhaps you know, take it in a few more stitches, maybe with a smaller stitch length so it's closer together and holds more. But that's what you can do if you find some errors. But this is laying flat, so I'm going to go ahead and just finish stitching a 1/4 inch across till it meets up here. Okay, and just back stitch the beginning and end of that line you just did. And so now that's the last of what we need the sewing machine for. We'll get to hand stitching in a moment, but first I want to talk about thread.